Next, Mr. Chameleon and the Unwanted Child murder clue. Tonight, we again present the famous Mr. Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters in his famous cases of crime and murder, brought to you by the makers of genuine Bayer aspirin. Mr. Chameleon, as you know, is the famous and dreaded detective who frequently uses a disguise to track down a killer, a disguise which at all times is recognized by the audience. Tonight, we give you Mr. Chameleon in The Unwanted Child murder clue. There is nothing quite so sad as a love which has been poisoned and which has turned into something bitter and unhappy. And as Stanley Sampson faces his wife Adele across the dinner table, his words, like a knife, strike deep into her heart.
Answer me, Adele. What's happened to you? Why are you acting this way about my son?
Your son. Jimmy is my son, too.
Then act as if you cared for him a little, won't you? You act like he's an unwanted child.
Stanley, I do want him. I love him.
Yes, you do. Then why do you refuse to have other children? Before we were married, you said you wanted several. But now even poor little Jimmy is wanted.
Stanley, I can't explain.
Don't try to explain. Your actions speak louder than words anyhow. My Uncle John and Felicia have both asked about your lack of affection for Jimmy. It's obvious to everyone.
Is it? Well, let me tell you something, Stanley. Your uncle and his ward, they have no right to criticize my behavior toward my son. They have no right to be living here under this roof.
Oh, nonsense.
It's not nonsense. Jimmy is my concern, not theirs. Being a good mother is a 24-hour-a-day job, and it's my job, not yours. I know what's best for Jimmy.
It's my job, too. I happen to love Jimmy. Adele, I want a divorce. And the custody of my son.
Stanley.
I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel about things now. Jimmy will be much better off with me. Alone.
No, that's not true. I won't let you have him. You'd ruin him, Stanley, and I'll never let you have him.
But the following morning, in the big Sampson house in the East 60s, things seem to be calmer, at least on the surface. And at the breakfast table, Adele sits pouring the coffee, while Stanley's white-haired Uncle John says to her gently,
"That's quite enough, Adele. I've already had one cup. And by the way, where's Stanley? He's late, isn't he?
He's having his first cup of coffee in his study. He usually does.
But then he always comes in here for something to eat. It's time he started for the office. I'd better call him, Adele.
Oh, leave him alone, Uncle John. He'll come when he's ready.
But it's getting late, Adele. I'd better call him. Stanley? Stanley? Adele, are you sure he's in the study?
I'm not sure of anything.
I'd better see. Stanley? Stanley! Oh, good heavens, Adele, he's lying on the floor. He must be ill. Adele. He's dead.
And shortly afterwards, we find Mr. Chameleon, the great detective, examining the sprawling body of Stanley Sampson. And while Adele Sampson looks on, weeping softly, Mr. Chameleon says to Detective Dave Arnold,
Dave, hand me that cup of coffee on the table there, please.
You think it's poisoned, Mr. Chameleon?
I'm almost sure that's what killed him. You smell it. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's poisoned, all right. Mrs. Sampson?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon.
Who brought your husband this coffee?
Why, I honestly don't know. Stanley always had his first cup in here in the study. He always said he wasn't fit to speak to anyone till he had his coffee.
Well, who usually brings it to him?
I think Agnes. Agnes Luce. She's my son's nurse. She was mine when I was a child.
Dave, you go and fetch her, please.
Yes, Mr. Chameleon.
Mrs. Sampson, suppose you tell me what you know about this murder. Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to kill your husband?
I can't imagine, Mr. Chameleon. Stanley was difficult, but I loved him. I loved him.
In this investigation, I shall have to ask many questions of many people. Now, if there is anything that you can tell me, I should rather hear it from you.
Stanley and I had a quarrel just last night, Mr. Chameleon.
What about?
I can't tell you. It has nothing to do with poor Stanley's death.
It might have. Let me be the judge of that, please.
No, it hasn't.
The very fact that the thought of that quarrel upsets you suggests that it may have a bearing on the case.
Mr. Chameleon, if the thought of that quarrel upsets me, it's because my husband is dead. And we quarreled before he died. It's too horrible.
Did you love your husband, Mrs. Sampson? Are you sorry that he's dead?
Of course I'm sorry that he's dead. But I...
Yes?
Mr. Chameleon, do you believe in heredity?
Heredity?
Yes. I do. I wish I didn't, but I do.
Mr.
And I
Chameleon,
can't.
here's Agnes Luce, the nursemaid.
Oh. Come in, Miss Luce. I'm Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters.
Oh, you are you? And what right does that give you to make my poor lamb cry?
Miss Adele, it's all right. I'm here. Agnes is here. She won't let anyone hurt you. She never has she?
Oh, Agnes, it isn't Mr. Chameleon who makes me cry. Poor Stanley.
I know, but you didn't kill him, dearie, and no cop can make you say you did.
Look here, you can't talk to Mr. Chameleon that way.
That's all right, Dave. Agnes, you seem to be devoted to Mrs. Sampson.
I should be. I nursed her and now her little Jimmy.
And you wouldn't let anyone hurt her, not even her husband.
And what do you mean by that?
Who brought him his morning coffee?
Why, I did, Mr. Chameleon. Sure. You don't think I killed him?
I haven't said that. He was poisoned, Agnes, and the poison was in his coffee.
And a lot of people could have put it there. He had his own special coffee pot.
I suppose Mr. Chameleon even thinks that I might have done it, Agnes.
Then he ought to be ashamed.
Mr. Chameleon, this nursemaid is getting out of hand, if you ask me.
I didn't mean anything, Mr. Chameleon. I just...
Yes, go on, Agnes.
Miss Adele wouldn't hurt anyone. It was her husband, Stanley Sampson, who was selfish and maybe worse than selfish.
What do you mean?
He hurt Adele. He had no business to have his Uncle John living here in the house. He had no business having that girl under the same roof.
What girl?
Felicia Walters, Mr. John's ward. She's too young, too pretty. And she was crazy about Mr. Sampson.
Is this true, Mrs. Sampson? Was this girl in love with your husband?
I can't answer that, Mr. Chameleon.
Well, I can, Miss Adele. I found a note he wrote to her once, to Miss Felicia Walters. It was left lying in a book, and that note showed what was going on. It's wicked that they should all have been under the same roof. It's no wonder Miss Adele's been acting so strange about Jimmy.
I see, Agnes. Mrs. Sampson, have you been acting strangely about your son?
Mr. Chameleon...
Is that why you spoke of heredity just now? You were saying that you believed in it when Agnes walked in. What does heredity have to do with it? With your child, with your husband's murder?
Nothing. I swear, Mr. Chameleon, nothing.
Dave, where is Felicia Walters?
In the next room, Mr. Chameleon.
Will you wait here, Mrs. Sampson, please? I may want you very shortly. And you too, Agnes.
Yes, sir.
You'd better think of a better explanation, Agnes, of how it happened to be you who took Stanley Sampson as poisoned coffee.
Mr. Chameleon.
Dave, will you stay with him, please, while I talk to Felicia Walters? Miss Walters, I am Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters.
How do you do, Mr. Chameleon? I heard you were here. If there's anything I can do... Of course, I know there's nothing I can do which will bring Stanley back to life.
No, I'm afraid there isn't. Miss Walters, have you been living here in Stanley Sampson's house very long?
Oh, about 6 months. Stanley's Uncle John is my guardian, you know. He'd been having a rather hard time financially, and Stanley was kind enough to insist that we come here.
Well, that's been rather hard on Mrs. Sampson, hasn't it?
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, Miss Walters, you're a very attractive girl. I understand that Mr. Sampson was very much in love with you.
In love with me? Mr. Chameleon, who told you a thing like that?
Agnes Luce, the nursemaid.
I might have known. Agnes is a pathetic, unbalanced old woman. She's fiercely possessive of Adele and Jimmy. It's really very unhealthy. Stanley thought so, too.
To the point where he wanted to divorce her, Miss Walters?
I think so. His Uncle John knew more about that than I do.
Miss Walters, Stanley Sampson was a careless man.
What?
I say he was a careless man. He's the sort of man who leaves personal letters lying around in books.
I don't understand, Mr. Chameleon.
A letter was found hidden in a book. A letter from Stanley Sampson to you, showing quite clearly that he was infatuated with you.
And how do you know that nursemaid Agnes didn't make that up?
Did she? Now think. Think carefully before you reply. For all you know, that letter may be in my possession.
Mr. Chameleon, it's quite true that Stanley wrote me occasional notes, but we meant nothing to each other. Not anymore. We may have once before his marriage, but that was just a boy and girl affair. Believe me, it ended a long time ago.
What about Mrs. Sampson? Do you like her, Miss Walters?
Oh, very much. I feel terribly sorry for Adele, though, and sorry for little Jimmy, too.
Do you mean that she is not a good mother?
Oh, she tries to be, Mr. Chameleon. But I'm afraid Jimmy is an unwanted child. And she has such a phobia about... That's none of my business.
Well, it may be mine, Miss Walters. What is this phobia about? Heredity?
Yes, how did you know? That's it. All Adele talks about, Mr. Chameleon, is heredity.
Felicia.
Oh, John. Oh, Mr. Chameleon, this is Stanley's Uncle John, and my guardian, Mr. Clark.
How do you do, Mr. Clark? Did you have some reason for interrupting your ward so sharply when she was telling me about Adele Sampson's abnormal concern with heredity?
I didn't mean to interrupt, Mr. Chameleon.
No? Mr. Clark, it was you who discovered your nephew's body, wasn't it?
Yes. It was a hideous shock, of course. Stanley wasn't the easiest man in the world to live with, but I was very fond of him.
Would you say he was a good husband?
In many ways, yes.
And a good father?
He loved little Jimmy very much.
More than his mother does?
I'd rather not answer that, Mr. Chameleon.
In other words, yes? Why is Adele Sampson afraid of heredity?
Mr. Chameleon, you're asking some very strange questions. Why not try to find out who gave Stanley the poisoned coffee? Seemed to me that'd be much more to the point.
On the contrary, Mr. Clark. Anyone in this house could have poisoned the coffee. I want to know about the child and the heredity angle. Now, what's it all about? What's behind it?
Nothing, I'm sure.
We shall see. Mr. Sampson, will you come in here, please?
What are you going to do, Mr. Chameleon?
I intend to find out how the child enters into it. Mrs. Sampson,
Yes, Mr. Chameleon.
would you say that you've been a good mother to your child?
What? If Uncle John and Felicia said that I haven't, it's a dreadful injustice to me.
Oh, we didn't say that, Adele.
Of course you did. Everyone thinks I don't love my Jimmy. Even Stanley believed it. That's what broke my heart. And it's not true. It just isn't true that I don't love my son, Jimmy.
Well, then, what is true, Mrs. Sampson? Why does everyone think that you don't love him?
I can't tell you.
Mrs. Sampson, now your actions so far indicate to me that you're deeply attached to your son. Almost to the point of an obsession.
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. That's why But I'm so strict with him. I'm afraid...
Go on, Mrs. Sampson.
No, Adele, wait. Don't say something you'll be sorry for.
Mr. Clark, keep out of this, please.
I can't bear it any longer. I can't bear to have people believe I don't love my child.
Then tell me the truth, Mrs. Sampson.
Mr. Chameleon, my husband, Stanley, had a criminal record. And I was afraid that my son would inherit his father's criminal tendencies. I couldn't tell Stanley. I knew I couldn't tell anyone. I've been carrying that knowledge alone for months.
Who told you that your husband had a criminal record?
He did. Uncle John.
Adele, that's ridiculous. Mr. Chameleon, she's been completely unbalanced by Stanley's death.
I should think she might be. Her husband was ruthlessly murdered. But whether her statement is a fact or a figment of her imagination, that is the clue that's going to lead me to Stanley Sampson's murderer.
Mr. Chameleon and the Unwanted Child murder clue continues in just a moment. When you have an ordinary headache, fast relief is important, but even more important is gentle, dependable relief. And that's why it will pay you to always use genuine Bayer aspirin. For Bayer aspirin is one thing you can take with complete confidence. No other pain reliever can match Bayer aspirin's record of use by millions of normal people without ill effect. Yes, for the two most important kinds of relief, always use genuine Bayer aspirin. Because it's actually ready to go to work in 2 seconds, it will bring you the fast relief you want. And because it's reliable, you can take it sure in the knowledge that it will bring you the gentle relief that's important to your health. So whenever you're in pain, don't experiment with drugs that have not stood the test of time. Instead, use something that millions know from experience is completely dependable. genuine Bayer aspirin. And when you buy, ask for it by its full name, Bayer aspirin, not just for aspirin alone. Get the 100-tablet bottle and you get Bayer aspirin tablets for less than a penny apiece. And now back to Mr. Chameleon and the unwanted child murder clue. The poisoned death of Stanley Sampson has had strange ramifications involving his wife Adele and his Uncle John and even his small son Jimmy, the child that everyone believed was unwanted. And now sometime later in the library of the Sampson home, we find Mr. Chameleon looking over the bookshelves and saying to Detective Dave Arnold,
Dave, look at this. Half a dozen books on heredity. Adele Sampson was certainly obsessed by the subject.
And a woman who is obsessed can be dangerous, Mr. Chameleon. Dangerous enough to kill.
Yes, you're quite right, Dave. If this thing grew in her mind, this fear that her son might inherit his father's criminal tendencies, it might very easily drive her over the edge to murder.
What about the old guy?
Uncle John? Dave, he denied that he told her that her husband had a criminal record. So one of them is lying, either Uncle John or Mrs. Sampson. Oh, I'll take it, Dave. I asked the commissioner to call me here. Hello?
Hello, Chameleon.
Yes, Commissioner. I thought it might be you. Any news?
Only that as far as we can find out, Stanley Sampson had no criminal record whatsoever. He was a highly respected man, was never in trouble with the police.
That is very interesting. Either Mrs. Sampson imagined it or Stanley Sampson's Uncle John deliberately lied to her.
You really think that's the heart of the matter?
Yes, Commissioner. Somehow or other, Mrs. Sampson's fear of heredity has something to do with her husband's murder.
What about the Sampson house? Have you turned up any more clues?
Well, that depends on whether you think books can talk. I do, and Stanley Sampson's library's been telling me plenty. Oh, someone's coming. I'll be at police headquarters within the hour, Commissioner.
Good. Meanwhile, I'll put 3 men on the Sampson household, Chameleon, so that the whole family can be shadowed.
You'd better make it 4, Commissioner. The nursemaid, Agnes Luce, will bear watching, too. Goodbye.
Mr. Chameleon?
Oh, Agnes. So it's you I heard coming down the hall. Well, what have we here?
Some hot coffee, Mr. Chameleon.
Well, isn't that thoughtful? It's just what Detective Arnold and I need. Tiring business searching a house for clues to a murder.
What makes you think you'll find any here in the library?
My dear Agnes, you never know where you're going to find a vital clue. But leave the coffee on the table, and thank you very much. Oh, Agnes, about Mr. Sampson's Uncle John, do you know very much about his financial affairs?
I only know he lived off Mr. Sampson, him and his ward. And I know he expects to inherit money from Mr. Sampson, money that should rightfully go to Mrs. Sampson. And I don't trust him, and I don't trust his ward, Felicia Walters.
And you hated the murdered man. In fact, you hate everyone in the family, Agnes, except Adele Sampson and little Jimmy.
You can't blame me, Detective Arnold. They're my whole life, Mr. Chameleon. Don't let your coffee get cold.
No, I won't, Agnes. Thanks again. Quite a household, Dave. Adele Sampson frantic with the belief that her husband was a criminal.
Mr. Chameleon.
And Uncle John, who, if he did say that his nephew Stanley Sampson had a criminal record, deliberately lied.
Mr. Chameleon.
And pretty Felicia Walters, and an old nursemaid whose whole life, as she says, is Adele Sampson and her son, and who admits that she hated Sampson. Quite a household.
Mr. Chameleon, put down that coffee.
Why, Dave? Surely you don't think I intend to drink it? Not a chance. This coffee is being taken to Central Police Headquarters to be analyzed to see if it contains any poison.
And sometime later, at police headquarters, we find Mr. Chameleon restlessly pacing his office. And the impatience in his voice when he speaks to Detective Dave Arnold is extremely unusual for him.
Where the devil is that laboratory report? Why don't they send it in? Should have had that coffee analyzed by now.
I imagine they're doing it as fast as they can, Mr. Chameleon.
That's not fast enough. Speed, Dave, speed. It's of vital importance. I feel more so in this case than in almost any case I've ever handled.
But why, Mr. Chameleon?
Because Stanley Sampson's murderer, if they tried to kill me, is badly frightened. And a badly frightened killer is almost sure to strike again. Chameleon speaking. Oh, yes, Ed. Have you got a laboratory report for me? Uh-huh. I see. All right, Ed. Thank you. That's it, Dave.
Poisoned?
The coffee was poisoned. They tried to kill me the way they killed Stanley Sampson.
And Agnes, the nursemaid, brought that coffee to you.
That may or may not prove a thing. What is proven is that the killer is cornered, terrified. And we've got to move fast, terrifically fast.
What are you going to do, Mr. Chameleon?
Dave, whoever put poison in my coffee did so because they thought I was getting close to the truth. Well, I'm going to pretend that I'm closer than I am. I'm going to pretend that I've hit on the truth.
But how?
This evening, Dave, I want you to go to Sampson's home. Get them all together. Adele Sampson, Uncle John, Felicia Walters, Agnes. Put them through a routine questioning. But have them all in one room.
And what about you?
I'll arrive about 9 o'clock, after the neighborhood lending library closes.
The what?
The lending library. There's one right around the corner from the Sampson home. And, Dave, when you see me, I shall be in disguise. Disguised as Harry Chandler, the man who runs the lending library.
And so, that night, a little after 9 o'clock, we find Mr. Chameleon disguised as Harry Chandler, a very prim young man wearing horn-rimmed glasses. And when Agnes, the Sampsons' nursemaid, opens the door, Mr. Chameleon speaks in the voice of his disguise.
How do you do? My name is Chandler. Are you, Mrs. Sampson?
No, I'm Agnes Luce, the nurse. What can I do for you?
Well, is Mrs. Sampson in?
Yes, but she's busy.
I understand that Mr. Sampson was murdered, and I have a note here. A note which was written to him.
What? Let me have it.
I'm, sorry. If you don't mind, I'd rather turn it over to Mrs. Sampson herself.
Very well. Come in. This way, please. They're all in the living room being questioned by the police.
Oh, really? Well, of course, this note may not be important, but on the other hand... Oh, dear, there are a lot of people in there, aren't there? Well, maybe I better not. Well, no, I guess I will.
Mrs. Sampson?
Yes, Agnes.
There's a gentleman here to see you. Something about Mr. Sampson. His name is Chandler.
How do you do, Mr. Chandler?
How do you do?
This is Miss Walters.
How do you do?
Mr. Clark and Detective Arnold.
How do you do?
How are you?
do?
Did you have something to say to me about my dead husband?
Yes, Mrs. Sampson. You see, I'm a librarian. That is, I work at the lending library right around the corner. You see, I read in the paper that Mr. Sampson was dead.
Murdered, Mr. Chandler.
Oh, yes, quite so, Detective Arnold. Anyway, Mr. Sampson had a bad habit of leaving notes and what have you in the books that he returned to my lending library.
What do you mean?
Well, just that, Mrs. Sampson, just that. The day before your husband was murdered, he returned a book to the library, and in it I found a note. Very personal note, and, I felt it should be given to you or to the police.
Why the police?
Because, frankly, Detective Arnold, it throws a light on the murder.
Let me have that note, Mr. Chandler.
Well, I really don't know if I should, Detective Arnold.
I said let me have it.
Oh, well, of course, if you insist. See, where is it? Oh, it's right here.
No, give me that note.
Miss Walters.
Give it to me, Mr. Chandler. That note belongs to me.
You don't say, Miss Walters. That's very interesting.
Mr. Chameleon.
Mr.
Chameleon in disguise.
Yes, Mr. Chandler, the librarian, does not exist. And neither does the note that you claim is yours, Miss Walters.
But you
Now,
said...
you've been searching for that note, Miss Walters. I knew someone had been searching frantically for a note. The books in the Sampson library told me that. There isn't one of them that has dust on it. They've all been searched. You were desperate, Miss Walters, because you'd written Stanley Sampson a letter which was extremely incriminating, which showed that you were in love with him.
No.
And it was you who kept the infatuation alive. And you expected him to divorce his wife and marry you. And when he wouldn't, you killed him in a jealous rage.
No. John, don't let him say these things.
Also, it was you who suggested to Agnes, the nursemaid, that she bring me the coffee which you had poisoned.
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. Felicia did suggest it. That's quite true.
No, you're lying.
All the evidence is against you, Felicia Walters. You alone tried to break up Stanley Sampson's marriage, and then you murdered him.
But John encouraged me. He engineered everything.
Felicia!
John did tell the lie about Stanley being a criminal. He thought if Stanley was married to me, we'd be better off financially.
Which was a wicked thing to do. Almost as vicious as murder. Nevertheless, it was you, Miss Walters, who killed him. And it's you who'll stand trial alone. Dave, quick, she's putting something in her mouth.
Give that to me.
No.
Give it to me. There.
Oh, I want to die. I want to die.
She tried to swallow a capsule of poison, Mr. Chameleon. I guess that does it.
That does it. The same poison, I'm sure, that Felicia used to kill Stanley Sampson, and with which she tried to kill me. Take her down to Police Central Headquarters. As for you, Mr. Clark, as I said, the part you played was almost as evil. To poison a wife's love and to persecute a mother by spreading stories that the child she adores is unwanted. Well, it's over and done with now.
Thank God, Mr. Chameleon, that a man of your understanding came from the police to solve my husband's murder.
Well, I operate on the belief that the innocent must be protected and the guilty punished. And I'd like to make clear, Mrs. Sampson, that criminal tendencies are not inherited by a child. That's a mistaken idea.
How cruel of John Clark to have told me that.
So you know that your son Jimmy's future is secure. You need never fear that he will inherit any criminal tendencies or that he will be pointed out as an unwanted child of yours.
And with these words, Mr. Chameleon concludes tonight's murder case. In response to many requests from mothers, genuine Bayer aspirin has been made available in a new children's-sized tablet. A tablet which now enables you to conveniently give your children the proper dosage as prescribed by your doctor. This is because each of these new tablets contains only half the amount of the regular-sized Bayer aspirin tablet you take, and they're made so you can break them right in half whenever still smaller dosages are needed. Because they are uncolored and unflavored, they cannot be mistaken for candy. And new children's-sized Bayer aspirin, like regular-sized Bayer aspirin, may be used with utmost confidence. For the fact that doctors prescribe Bayer aspirin's single active ingredient even for the smallest children shows how gentle and dependable it is. The bottle and carton are plainly marked children's size Bayer aspirin. 30 tablets for 25 cents. Listen next Wednesday night at this same time for Mr. Chameleon, the man of many faces, in The Girl Who Typed Murder. The part of Mr. Chameleon is played by Carl Swenson, with dialogue by Marie Baumer, from the original story by Frank and Ann Hummert. Music directed by Victor Arden. Your announcer is Howard Claney.
Important to everyone is the news of a remarkable scientific discovery which now makes it possible to cut down tooth decay and the pain, worry, and expense that go with it. What you do is use new ammoniated Dr. Lyon's tooth powder. Based on a formula developed by University of Illinois scientists, it cuts down tooth decay, actually helps prevent cavities. That's why so many dentists recommend this type dentifrice. So for sounder, healthier, handsomer teeth, use ammoniated Dr. Lyon's tooth powder. Both regular Dr. Lyon's tooth powder and new ammoniated Dr. Lyon's are at all drug and toilet goods counters.
Listen for Mr. Chameleon in The Girl Who Typed Murder next Wednesday night at this time. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.